old guy here, and I did a video a while ago on a decade series of books, 1900 to 1910, so I thought I'd advance it 10 years and see what the reading public thought was good enough to earn their pence or shillings or clamshells or whatever they used for currency back then from 1910 to 1920. Now, the zeitgeist of these 10 years are very different than the previous 10, primarily because of that 800-pound gorilla, World War I, which showed up in the middle. These 10 years, in fact, are going to inform the next 10 years, 1920 to 1930, as the lost generation emerges. But what was the lost generation reading before it became lost? Well, that would be these books. I don't know a lot of these books that were published during this time, so I selected the best-selling novel of each year according to Bookman. And again, this is a swag on my part because there wasn't a bestseller list back then and not a lot of information who was reading what. I based it on how many books were sold, which may indicate popularity, but not necessarily a quality read. And of course, I added my own personal opinion, which that and a quarter will get you a tuppence. 1910, The Rosary by Florence Barclay. Best-selling book of the year. It was adapted into 5 films, so it must have some kind of entertainment value. This is the story of a plain Jane Champion, who all the guys think of as just another one of the boys until she sits down one evening and sings a song called The Rosary while accompanying herself on piano. The boys then see her as much more than one of the guys and begin to pitch woo. But plain Jane is flummoxed by all of the tension and flees a person who is possibly her true love. Now, there are a few other interesting books from this year, including The Kingdom of Slender Swords by Halle Ermini Rivas, about which I cannot get a straight answer. It's either set in Japan or set in Spain or both, and it may be a fantasy or a romance or both. Who knows? Rivas was notorious for writing another novel called Smoking Flax, which extols the virtues of lynching. 1911. The novel is The Broad Highway by Geoffrey Farnall. Actually sounds like a fun book along the lines of Tom Jones. Peter Vibart is a gentleman awaiting the dispersal of his uncle's estate when he discovers he's only getting 10 guineas. Unless he marries someone he really doesn't want to, so he takes his 10 G's and heads out to make his fortune. Now, in the previous video, I talked about the book To Have and to Hold, and written by Mary Johnston, who was a proto-feminist back there. And she also had a bestseller during this year called The Long Roll, which is set during the Civil War and tells the exploits of a Stonewall Brigade artillerist. Johnson herself was a cousin to Joseph E. Johnston, the Confederate general, so you can guess who gets the favorable treatment here. 1912, The Harvester by Gene Stratton-Porter. David Langston lives in the woods with his faithful dog companion Belshazzar, cultivating and harvesting medical plants. It is a solitary and fulfilling life, but it's spring and a young man's fancy turns to thoughts of love. Can he find the right women or woman? And of course, there are plenty of townspeople who think a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. All these quotes, huh? Must have a degree in literature or something. And they're willing to help him with this search. Now, Jean is short for Geneva, and she was quite the accomplished woman who did nature photography and owned her own silent film studio. This book was turned into a silent film, as was another one of her books called The Girl of the Limberlost. A lot of the books on this list, in fact, became films. 1913, The Inside of the Cup by Winston Churchill. So here we have that Winston Churchill guy who also shows up on the previous list. And no, it's not the cigar-chewing bowler hat one, but an American author who was so popular that the Prime Minister signed his books William Spencer Churchill to differentiate. John Hodder is a small-town preacher who is recruited to be the rector of a much larger and richer St. John's Church in a Midwest city which is a thinly disguised St. Louis. He is chosen because the rich patrons of the church want a Christian orthodoxy that will not oppose the growing corporate power and corruption of concentrated wealth. But Hodder is distressed by the decaying neighborhood and begins to preach the love and service of mankind, which gets him into quite a bit of trouble. The title comes from Matthew 23:26, where Jesus admonishes the Pharisees for having a cup clean on the outside, but the inside is dirty. This was a very controversial book when it came out, with preachers either railing against it or fully endorsing it. And it was also the best-selling novel of 1914, the first novel to be a bestseller in consecutive years. 1914, since we already know it's the cup, let's go for number 2, which was The Eyes of the World by Harold Bell Wright. A young painter named Aaron King moves to California and befriends a famous novelist named Conrad LaGrange, who considers all of his best-selling work as nothing but putrid offal, O-F-F-A-L. King must decide whether he will keep his artistic integrity or sell out to the patrons. A critic of the novel called it a great example of the quack novel, which I guess means it's just fake moralizing. Like Wright would care, I mean, he was one of the first authors to make $1 million from his wildly popular books. He had a terrible childhood, sleeping on haystacks when he was like 12 and 13 years old as he walked from town to town looking for work. Yes, he had the last laugh. Incidentally, there's some anomalies with the information here, because I thought that John Fox was the first author to make $1 million with his Little Shepherd from Kingdom Come, which I covered in the previous video. Info seems a bit inconsistent from the ancient days. There's another book published this year that I really enjoyed when I was a kid. That's Penrod by Booth Tarkington. It's an updated Tom Sawyer tale, and I liked it so much I think I have read all of the Penrod books at one time or another. 1915. Well, the war has been on for a year, so what was the best-selling book? Another Booth Tarkington, one called The Turmoil, which is not a Penrod story. It's the first novel of the Growth trilogy that precedes the magnificent Ambersons. Bibbs Sheridan is a dreamy-eyed would-be poet who has an aversion to work, while his father, self-made industrialist and social maven, can think of nothing else. Since Bibbs is his heir, well, you can see where the turmoil of the title comes from. Winston Churchill has another book this year called A Far Country, which is about a corporate lawyer whose job changes his values, and another Gene Stratton-Porter, Michael O'Halloran, which is about an orphan newsboy. She's still using Jean as her first name instead of Geneva. Wonder if she's following the George Sands strategy. Oh, and we get our first Zane Grey on the top 10 called The Lone Star Ranger. 1916. Well, look at this. Another Tarkington. The book 17. William Baxter, the 17-year-old of the title, falls madly in love with the vivacious Lola Pratt, who is visiting the family next door. And, well, you'll probably be embarrassed for William, as you probably are for your own 17-year-old behavior, which was 1972 for me, and I'd rather not dwell on that. An H.G. Wells novel appears this year, too. Mr. Britling Sees It Through, which is the first novel in which World War I appears, at least in the top 10. And this takes us, of course, to 1917, because Mr. Britling Sees It Through is the best-selling novel of this year. Mr. Britling is an accomplished novelist living the country squire life when the war breaks out and completely changes everything. Married to the indifferent Edith, Britling is in the middle of his 8th affair and blithely ignoring Prussian militarism until he no longer can. This book was a favorite of chaplain schools because of Wells' non-sectarian religious viewpoint. Now, another novel published this year, His Family, by Ernest Poole, was the first to win the Pulitzer Prize for the novel. Christine, another World War I novel, was published this year, written by Alice Cholmondeley, which is a pen name for Elizabeth Van Armen, which is a pen name for Mary Beauchamp, a novelist who had an affair with H.G. Wells and ended up marrying Bertrand Russell's older brother. 1918, the last year of the war, and a good escapist novel is the bestseller when, it covers a time when men were men and sheep were nervous. It's called The U.P. Trail by Zane Grey. Now, this is Gray's 17th novel and is in response to a challenge laid down by Rudyard Kipling that someone should write a story about the building of the Union Pacific, which is, the UP of the title. Allie Lee is fleeing with her mother from the Spanish gambler Andrade, who Mom ran away with when her marriage to the wealthy Allison Lee faltered, but now she's run away from him because she's on the outs with Andrade, so they hop a wagon train to California. Catch all that? A mountain man named Al Slingerland, lots of owls in this story, warns of an approaching Sioux war party, and there's a railroad engineer named Warren who becomes Allie's boyfriend, and a gunslinger named Red. Of course. 1919, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez. This is a Spanish novel that became the best-selling novel of the year. It's the story of the sons-in-law of an Argentine landowner who end up on opposite sides during World War I. Julio Madariaga, who fights for the French, and Karl Hartrott, who's married to Julio's sister, who fights for the Germans. This does not end well. Now, Ibáñez was quite a character. He was a Republican partisan who established several newspapers in Spain and was always in trouble. Charged for this, charged for that, tried for this, tried for that, and actually shot at several times, and once a bullet catching in his belt buckle. He was living in Paris when the war broke out and was a friend of Robert Service. And 1920, The Man of the Forest by Zane Grey. Milt Dale is a hunter living in the White Mountains of Arizona. He's got a pet cougar and only comes to town once or twice a year, where the locals consider him peculiar. He finds out that some dastardly villain plans to kidnap the niece of a rich rancher, and of course, he has to save the damsel in distress. All right, there we have it. 10 years worth of bestsellers. Funny, though, how a lot of the books during this time frame are really turning towards social commentary and criticism. It's like the people were questioning the status quo or something.